Giants. What weapons should they use? Hey folks, Matt Easton here, scholagladiatoria. So I have reviewed the Battle of the Bastards. I have reviewed the fight between Jon Snow and Ramsay Bolton that follows the Battle of the Bastards. Links below to those. But one of the points I made in both of those videos was that it was freaking stupid that they didn't give 1-1 a weapon. Usually in fantasy films and in fantasy books, giants have weapons such as clubs, for example. Now, I'll come back to that specific point in a minute, but in Game of Thrones, the TV series, as far as I can recall, the only weapon that we actually see giants using, at least a purpose-made weapon, are bows. And I actually thought that was very interesting because, of course, usually in fantasy stories, bows aren't given to giants for various reasons. I think the assumption that giants aren't able to make complex things like bows, even though bows aren't necessarily that complex to make. But if you actually think about it, so I think also people think about giants in hand-to-hand combat and they don't necessarily think about them in missile combat. But actually a missile weapon for a giant makes all kinds of sense because a giant can pull a huge amount of draw weight on a bow. Or if they're just throwing a rock, they can throw a really large rock. So they are like a one-person siege engine, which makes them incredibly effective, of course, because everybody knows that things like cannonballs or trebuchet stones can plough through lots of enemies. So if you've got a creature or an intelligent, giant, in this case, a giant person who can lob large objects, then clearly that's going to be a very effective thing in battle. They are potentially a siege engine, and if you think about it, certainly in the series we see 1-1 goes and punches his way through the door of Winterfell. We'll kind of ignore the fact that why does Winterfell only have one door? It's supposed to be one of the most hardcore fortresses in the north. Why doesn't it have, I know in the books it does, but why in the series doesn't it have, moats and maybe a portcullis and maybe a drawbridge, maybe a series of doors? But no, in the series it just has one door, so spent all of this energy building huge stone walls and towers and all this kind of stuff, but they just put one thin wooden door on the front. Anyway, let's ignore that interesting point, but 1-1 punches his way through the door, which, yeah, if there was only one thin wooden door there, you might think about doing, but in the process he gets filled with arrows, doesn't he? Because there's lots of archers on the walls. But what about, instead of just going and punching his way through that door, he just stood a little bit further away and picked up some rocks, throw, pick up another rock, throw, until it breaks. There we go, and he's no longer filled with arrows. There's not much logic. I think we have to conclude, if we're only watching the HBO series of Game of Thrones, we have to conclude 1-1, he isn't a genius, he's not that clever, and Jon Snow doesn't care. Because 1-1 is, as far as Jon Snow is concerned, he's disposable. He fills and gets full of arrows and breaks his way through the door. But coming back to the main point, what weapon, assuming that he wasn't just going to throw rocks, what weapon, if we're dealing with a more intelligent rendition of this world, what weapon should giants use? Well, I'm holding a sword for no specific reason other than the fact I like to hold weapons in my videos. But should a giant use a sword? Well, there are a few issues with swords. I don't think it's a bad weapon for a giant to use, but in terms of manufacturing, it would be really difficult. Large pieces of iron and steel in the medieval world, or with medieval type technology, making the bigger the piece of metal, the more difficult it is to make it of a sturdy, strong standard. And really, what does a giant gain from using a sword? They're probably, for the most part, not going to be fighting other giants. And if they can do the same thing with a club, which is easier to make and might be more effective against small people, then they're more likely to use that, aren't they? But a sword is a medium length weapon, so if we just break it down, you've essentially got short weapons like knives and daggers, you've got medium length weapons like swords, certain types of axe, Warhammer, maces, things like this, and then you've got long weapons, pole arms, things like spears and glaives and halberds and such like. And then there's unusual weapons like flails. Now I'll just go through the points. But before I do, I just want to say there are a few things which dictate what weapon a giant might use. Number one, what are they able to physically get access to? Okay, that's the first thing. Secondly, what are they able to make? I've already mentioned the sword. Could you make a giant-sized sword? Difficult. Next thing is, what would a giant naturally want to use? We can't really answer that question because we don't know, because giants don't exist. And thirdly, what makes the most martial sense in the context in which giants might be fighting? Well, again, we don't really know that, because in a different context, in a different world, in a different fantasy world, giants may be fighting other giants, or giants may be fighting dragons, or giants may be fighting humans. And all of those different opponents lead to different weapons. Now let's look at the weapons for a second. Giants are big. We've established that. The clue is in the name. But they're only giant in relation to us, to humans. They're not giant in relation to mammoths particularly, or in relation to dragons. We know that in Game of Thrones world, mammoths exist and dragons exist. Now if a giant is fighting a dragon, the weapon that they're probably going to choose is somewhat similar to what a human would choose if they were fighting a crocodile, or a tiger, something like that. And so what are they probably going to choose? They're probably going to choose some form of polearm, like a spear, like a boar spear, probably, and missile weapons, so bows and crossbows. So if 1-1 the giant was preparing and had access to any weapons of his choice and was preparing to fight dragons, what he'd be best advised using are pole weapons and missile weapons, and possibly shields, okay? Especially against dragons. If you think if they're breathing fire, you're probably going to want some kind of shield that's fireproof. That would be quite useful, wouldn't it? You could hide behind the shield and then stab the dragon with the boar spear, just like in Dragon Slayer. Great film. But if the giant was preparing to fight other giants, well then it kind of cancels out. Then we're just asking, what weapons do humans use? And of course there's different weapons for different scenarios. If they're fighting in battle, in lines, then probably things like pikes and halberds are quite useful. If they're carrying weapons all day with the potential of self-defense, then things like swords are very useful. If they're fighting against people in armor, then things like maces and warhammers are useful. So again, we come into my favorite C word, almost my favorite C, is context. And so it comes down to the fact of, what are their opponents wearing? Are they in groups? Are they fighting in groups? Are they fighting individual? Are they outnumbered? All of those kind of things. Is it siege warfare? Is it naval warfare? Is it land warfare? So let's ignore the giants versus giants, because the giants versus giants question is essentially the same as humans versus humans. Now, what I think is potentially more interesting is giants versus humans, and certainly this seems more applicable in the Game of Thrones world, because humans are very numerous and giants are not very numerous. In fact, I believe 1-1 is the last of the giants, and soon to be the no more giants. And if he was fighting humans, as he is here, so he's fighting Ramsay Bolton's men, for example, what is the best armament for 1-1 the giant, or indeed any giant fighting against humans? First of all, I would say armor, quite important, because you are a arrow magnet, okay? You're a great big tower standing there. The enemy humans are all going to go, holy fuck, it's a giant, and they're all going to shoot at you, okay? So number one, any type of body armor you can get, okay? Even if it's just loads and loads of fur, even if you don't have the ability to get roof tiles or planks of wood and turn it into wooden scale armor or whatever else you can get, then just lots and lots of layers of fur. That will actually be quite effective against human-powered bows, especially if you have like 3 layers of thick clothing over the top. It's essentially a gambeson. That's the first thing. Whether you've got that or whether you can't get that for some reason, then a shield. A shield's super important, because again, remember, these humans are going to think, I'm not going to get into hand-to-hand combat with a giant because it's just going to squash me. What we're going to do is we're going to stay back, we're going to stay in a group, and we're going to shoot. Okay, so a giant shield, a pavis, sometimes known in role-playing games as a tower shield. Why they don't use the word pavis, I have no idea, but the actual historical word is pavis. Some people say pavis, but pavis, it's a large shield, somewhat like a Roman scutum actually, but they were still used in the medieval period. It's essentially like a door with a handle on the back. So a large rectangular shield. And you know what? Not only is that good against missile weapons, it's also good potentially against siege weapons, but also good against hand-to-hand combat, because if you do get surrounded by humans, they can't reach your body, but they can reach your legs, so you want a long shield. So I'm leveling up 1-1 the giant here. He's now going to have body armour and a long shield, a pavis, okay, that comes all the way down to the ground. He can carry it easily. Doesn't need to be that thick, because remember, his opponents are humans. So the shield relative to him can be fairly thin, fairly light, because these puny humans, as the Hulk would say, can't get through his door thickness shield, which to him is quite light because he's super massive. Next thing is, what weapon? Well, given that he's carrying a shield, and I do think it's important that he carries a shield for the reasons aforementioned, he should be using a weapon that he can use at the same time as using a shield. Now, if he used a pole weapon, the problem with using pole weapons one-handed is you can't usually, whilst you can reach a long way, you can't swing things like halberds or pole axes or bills. You can't really swing them one-handed, they're too unwieldy. But you can use thrusting pole arms at the same time as using a shield. But thrusting pole arms, if you're fighting multiple opponents, aren't necessarily that good, especially if you're a giant and you're trying to poke puny little humans. So a spear, whilst a spear human against human or giant against giant is very good, I think a spear against numerous human opponents is not particularly good, because it's a bit like trying to pick up the last peas on your plate with your fork. So I think that's not very good. What he really wants is something he can swing. And he doesn't need a sword, because he doesn't really need the benefits that a sword offers. He really needs something to splat humans into the ground. He doesn't need to pierce them, he doesn't need to cut them, he doesn't need to bother about getting through armour, because one hit from him to just squash a man in armour. So the predictable answer is a club or a mace. And so what giants are usually given in fantasy literature and art, I think is absolutely the best thing, but must be coupled with a shield. Because without a shield and without armour, giants are definitely vulnerable. And remember, even a shield is to a certain degree monodirectional. So even if I've got a large shield and I'm protecting myself here, the humans, the puny little humans, might run around the back of me and start peppering me with arrows from behind. And even though they're not going to penetrate deeply into me because I'm large and hard, if I've got some degree of armour, that's going to help protect me. But really what I want is a large splatting club. One of the things I meant to come round to at the beginning of the video, and which I want to mention here, is fighting humans when you're a giant is very specifically about splatting them into the ground. Some people are, in comments underneath my videos, mentioned a scythe. I actually like the idea of a scythe, so a giant kind of doing these great big, like reaping humans with his giant great scythe. The problem with the scythe is it requires the use of two hands realistically. And then you can't hold a shield, and therefore you're very vulnerable to arrows, crossbow bolts, cannons if they exist, trebuchets, any type of siege weapon. So you're very vulnerable to missile fire if you don't have a shield. The other problem with a scythe is I think it limits you to only sweeping just above the ground like this, which could be useful against humans, of course. But what if it isn't flat ground? What if you're fighting humans in rocky ground, or who are on a castle wall, or behind a defence? Then you can't hit them with your scythe. Your scythe would just get stuck on the obstructions. So scythes are very specifically for scything, and I don't think, although it's a nice idea and it would make a very good graphic, I think, in a film, I think in reality a scythe wouldn't be a very effective weapon for this purpose, despite the fact that it is featured in a historical treatise. If you look up Paulus Hector Mare, you can actually find the use of agricultural scythes used as a peasant weapon. But so I think the club, the one-handed club, where in any terrain, in any environment, at any range almost, the giant can just go splat, 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 and he can scythe along the ground with it, and it'll still wipe humans out, or he can splat them into the ground, and the club will be useful against other giants and dragons and mammoths and whatever else he wants to hit. And maybe a couple of javelins as well, something like this, javelins in a thing on his back or at his hip. So there we go. I think the perfect equipment, perfect armament for a giant in the world of Game of Thrones or any other fantasy environment that I'm aware of is some degree of padded armour or some other type of armour on the body, especially the legs, very important, okay? Potentially some kind of helmet as well, because everyone's head's vulnerable, even the giants, okay? If a rock hits you in the head, it's going to hurt a giant just as much as anyone else. A large, long shield, super important, one of the most important things. And then a one-handed club or mace, and perhaps with the addition of missile weapons such as javelins or a crossbow or a bow or something like this, depending on the technology available. So there we go, folks, some rambling, random thoughts about how Matt Easton would arm a giant. Cheers, folks. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, follow us on Facebook. You can buy t-shirts through Spreadshirt, support us on Patreon, or follow us on Pinterest. Thank you.